All right. Feel free to move down. I know people always say that, but you really should feel free to move down. These guys are very handsome. I mean, they're both on TV, so you really want to get a good chance to see these beautiful faces up close.
But no makeup today.
Yes.
Not yet,
Only
but the day is young. The day is young. So thank you guys so much for coming. My name is Barrett Berger. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Public Integrity, or CAPI. If you are not familiar with CAPI, if you have not gotten a chance to learn about us yet, you should definitely come check us out. We have a lot of pro bono projects for students, a lot of research opportunities. We actually have some papers back there listing some of the projects that we're looking at right now. So if you need a way to get your pro bono hours or are interested in corruption or integrity issues generally, you should definitely come and speak with us. I want to highlight one event we have coming up on November 27th. It's the Tuesday right after Thanksgiving, and I know you guys will be starting to focus on exams, but I would urge you to come. We're going to be screening a documentary about this large municipal fraud, and we have the producer of the documentary coming to talk to us all about whistleblowers. It's going to be a fantastic event. She's a very dynamic speaker, so put that on the back of your radar here. I want to thank SJI, who's our co-sponsor of today's event. Rachel Polly's sitting right over there. If you guys are interested in government work, corruption related or not, you should definitely talk to Rachel. She will get you to the right spot. Okay. Oh, and also sitting next to Rachel is Jennifer Rogers. She was the former executive director of CAPI. She's now on our board. She teaches here. She is an expert in this field, so another good person to talk to if you are interested in this type of work. All right, so let me introduce you to our two panelists here. Tim O'Brien is to my right here. Tim is the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, and he's a political analyst for NBC and MSNBC. Tim was previously the executive editor of the HuffPost, and he conceived, edited, and oversaw a 10-part series about wounded veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2012. He's worked with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Geographic. He won a Loeb Award for Distinguished Business Journalism in 1999, and he's the author of 3 books, including a biography of the president, TrumpNation, The Art of Being the Donald. President Trump actually sued Tim for libel in 2006, so that is a badge of honor, perhaps. He lost the case in 2011, the president, not Tim. And in case you aren't feeling bad enough about yourself, Tim has 3 master's degrees from Columbia, which really just seems like overkill.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Dan is over there. Dan is a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He's also a fellow at the Brennan Center at NYU, and he's on CAPI's board. Dan was an AUSA in the Southern District of New York for a decade. He served as senior trial counsel in the Securities and Commodities Unit and a deputy chief for the Organized Crime Unit, which is why he's able to bring all sorts of good mob knowledge to the conversations about the current administration, which is always fun to hear. Dan went to Stanford Law School. He clerked in the Northern District of California and the Second Circuit. And before becoming a lawyer, which I did not know about you, Dan, he was an Olympics researcher and a writer for NBC, and he won 3 Sports Emmys Awards. I didn't know there was such a thing, for coverage of NBC's 2000, 2002, and 2004 Olympics. So we have 2 complete all-stars here, and they're going to tell us all about the corruption scandals that we're facing in this administration. So, to jump right in. There you go. I like that.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to sit over here. On this little chair. Oh,
Okay.
Good. Okay.
Big chair.
Yeah, big chair. All right, I'm pretty loud. Okay, so during the presidential campaign, we heard the phrase "drain the swamp" a lot. It was repeated at rallies, and it seemed to be one of the president's, rallying cries. So I'd like to take a look 2 years later now and see if we actually have had any progress in draining that swamp. And I think I know the answer. So I want to start with one of the scandals that's been getting the most attention, which is obviously the special counsel's investigation into Russian interference with the election. So Dan, maybe I'll just start with you. It's been kind of quiet from the special counsel's office recently, because it's always quiet from them, but we haven't heard as much about them. Can you just give us a quick catch-up as to sort of where we are, what the status of things is with that investigation right now?
Sure. I mean, before any election, no prosecutor's office generally in the nation, federal or state, wants to impact the election. So there are no overt investigative steps, no charges that are usually, this is usually made, Jim Comey aside, that might have an impact on an election. So while we are not hearing a lot about the special counsel's investigation over the past month or so, really since Paul Manafort pled guilty, that does not mean that they are not working very hard. And the little bits and pieces that we have heard really do focus on the two new cooperating witnesses or potential cooperating witnesses who I actually think are game changers on multiple paths of this investigation. The first is Manafort. I think Manafort's cooperation is far and away the biggest event in the entire special counsel's investigation because he was the campaign chairman. He was the person within the campaign's orbit who had the most contacts and connections to Russia and pro-Russian Ukrainian oligarchs. And he also clearly, from his trial convictions and the evidence that came out at trial, does not mind breaking the law. So you put all those things together, and he really is at the center of whatever may have happened during the election in relation to interference by foreign countries or foreign nationals. So I think that if there was any conspiracy, what commonly is referred to as collusion, between Trump campaign and either the Russian intelligence officials who have already been charged or the Russian individuals who were engaged in the social media indictment back in February, or perhaps others who have yet to come out, I think Paul Manafort would know that. And so what we have learned, bits and pieces from the news media, is that Paul Manafort has been meeting extensively with the special counsel's office since he cooperated and pled guilty. So there's a lot that can come from that. We know he was at that critical June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr. and Jared and the Russian officials. He was originally hired by the campaign to sort of oversee the convention and kind of rally and gather delegates because there was some concern that...
For free.
For free, which is actually, I should mention, another reason why it's highly suspicious. And then the platform related to Russia mysteriously changed right in advance of the National Convention. And I think that may be a very critical element of the special counsel's investigation, because why did that happen? And with Manafort's involvement now, it's very shady. So I think there's a lot more to come based on that. And then the other person, and I'll let Tim speak to that if he wants, but is Michael Cohen, who's basically been begging any prosecutor's office to allow him to cooperate with them. And it looks like, from reporting we've gotten, and I think from some pretty good sources on this one, that he has been meeting both with the special counsel's office and the Southern District of New York, where he was charged, as well as the New York State Attorney General's office, which has a lawsuit against the Trump Foundation, and reports are an investigation into the Trump Organization. So Cohen might lead us more away from the election interference and into some of Trump's and his family's business dealings.
So before I move off you, Dan, so one thing that I feel like people have asked me questions about is, so for example with Cohen, he doesn't have a cooperation agreement at this point, right? So is he just meeting with these different prosecutors, out of the goodness of his heart? What is, legally speaking, what is he hoping for here?
Well, I think he would like everyone to believe it's out of the goodness of his heart. I don't think it is, because even a cooperation agreement is an agreement where the government basically offers to write a letter to the judge outlining all of the extensive cooperation or non-extensive cooperation, as the case may be, to explaining what it is so that the judge can use that to reduce the sentence. Even if you don't get a cooperation agreement, however, you can write to the judge and urge the judge to give you leniency. Michael Cohen could say, I made all these efforts to cooperate. They didn't give me a cooperation agreement for their own reasons, but I gave them all this information, so you should reduce my sentence. It's not as effective as a letter from the government, but it is still helpful. And as I think will likely happen, Michael Cohen could enter into a cooperation agreement yet still. So even though he doesn't have one right now, and that goes back, I think, a little bit to what you were talking about this moratorium over pre-election indictments or significant investigative events. I think the Southern District really wanted to charge him before Labor Day to get that out of the way so that they could finish that aspect of their investigation. He did not want to be charged, so he agreed to plead guilty and then sort of work on the cooperation during this lull. And I think that, as we've seen, that's what's happening.
Gotcha. So Dan mentioned this, the suit by the New York Attorney General's office. Can you tell us a little bit about how that affects the president and sort of what that's looking into? Because that seems like a whole new area.
Right, and there's also been the interesting Eric Schneiderman development and all of that. Which,
yes.
I guess, I think when I think about the sort of totality of these investigations right now, I sort of put them in three groups. I think we know very little. I don't think Bob Mueller's leaking. So everything that we know about, Bob Mueller appropriately, I think, is quiet and circumspect. I think there have been phases where we've gotten knowledge about the Mueller investigation. Initially, I think the National Security and Intelligence Community was leaking information to the press to force certain issues to the fore right after Trump came into power. Then I think there were defense attorneys around Jared Kushner and other targets who leaked to the press to protect their clients. And now you're in a phase of, I think a third phase where Rudy Giuliani's making things up. And I think there's a...
Do not believe anything he says.
That's right. He is like your grandfather who's gone out in the backyard late at night and doesn't know where to go. And you want to make sure he doesn't go into the woods and hurt himself. I think there's a collusion component of this. There's an obstruction of justice, and there may be a third that touches on high crimes and misdemeanors around financial quid pro quos that Trump might have, or people within the Trump universe might have traded with people in the Putin, Russia, Kremlin universe around policy issues. I think that's why the changes in Ukraine policy and economic sanctions in Russia are two very interesting issues, because I think there might have been horse trading around both of those that get to people like Manafort. The collusion stuff, I thought from the beginning of this didn't really imperil President Trump very much initially. But because he's ill-informed and unsophisticated, he possibly obstructed justice to try to get rid of a collusion investigation that may not have been very threatening to him. The collusion and the obstruction were clearly with Mueller. Initially, the New York State Attorney General was looking at the Trump Foundation, which is... I wouldn't even call it the charitable arm of the Trump organization, because Trump never put much money of his own into it. The McMahon family, she's now the Secretary of Education. Vince McMahon runs the WWE. They were the single largest benefactor of the Trump Foundation. I think he used it to get quid pro quos in business and political life and misused the funds that were in there. That eventually spurred the state AG to begin looking at it. I think at some point, when it became clear to Bob Mueller that his investigation or his independence might be imperiled, as a reporter looking at this, I'm just guessing, but I think some of what he did a joint investigation of Manafort with the New York State Attorney General's office. I think they've entered into a joint prosecution on Manafort, which I thought was odd, but then I thought it gave Mueller a conduit to move some of his documentation or what they were learning into the state AG's office. I wondered that as well about the Southern District. When they began going after Michael Cohen, apparently on a tip from Mueller's office initially, or evidence they got from Mueller's office, was that an effort by Mueller to insulate his investigation from presidential authority? Trump can't interfere in the New York State Attorney General's investigation the same way he might be able to in the federal investigation. I think the entirety of the New York State Attorney General's investigation, though, is on the foundation. I don't know that it goes beyond that, but by virtue of the issues involved, I'm sure they have Trump's tax returns and other financial documentation. I saw the president's tax returns during my litigation. That litigation's old now. He sued me in 2006, and it went on. It got dismissed in 2011. But during the course of that, I got several years of his tax returns. I'm certainly the only reporter who's seen that many years of it, and certainly probably one of the only people outside of the Trump organization. I can't speak to the particulars of that because they weren't sealed, but there's a court order that I can't. They were sealed, and there was a court order that I can't disclose their contents. But I'm allowed to speak generally about them. And he has, I think it would open him up to scrutiny on his charitable giving, clearly, on how robust his business really is. He's lied now for about 40 years about how much money he has and how big his business is. Flat out lying. I can say that with complete confidence. That was the substance of our litigation, in fact, and we killed him in court. My attorney was Mary Jo White, who was a former U.S. attorney for the Southern District. His was Mark Kasowitz, who's sort of a pipe fitter. And
tell us what you really think.
Really, though, I mean, they just out-lawyered them in a very profound way. I had great lawyers, so I was lucky I had the New York Times as attorneys. I love lawyers. I love all of you for wanting to be lawyers. But I think, that the charitable giving, the size of his business, and income from overseas. And I think that, to me, that last category is a huge unknown. And the media has been pretty good on that issue. There's this question mark of where he got the money to do a lot of deals that he did between about 2005 and 2015. A lot more money than the Trump organization was generating. So there's just a question of where did that money come from. And so I think that gets possibly into this third leg of, if there is a third stool, which I don't know, but did Trump at different points in his career get funds from interests overseas in exchange for anticipated or present policy changes? And that raises interesting questions like, why did Ukraine policy change on the Republican platform during the Republican convention at the last minute in the summer of 2016? Why was Michael Flynn, who has pleaded guilty about lying to the FBI about this, trying to horse trade with the Russian ambassador to the United States about economic sanctions on Russia? We know after the Helsinki meeting that the president had with Putin recently, when Putin got back to Moscow, he told reporters, both Russian reporters and Western reporters, that one of the things he and Trump talked about privately was changing the U.S.'s approach to Ukraine policy. So that's clearly a front-of-mind issue for Putin. And I think those are the three sort of baskets of things coming into play. And I think the AG piece of that is probably just the Trump Foundation, but still important because they have criminal exposure around that.
I would add, though, that I think my sense is there is an investigation now, perhaps spurred by Cohen, or at least informed by Cohen, into the Trump organization. We don't necessarily know the extent of that. I think whether it's the Southern District or the New York Attorney General's office, or both, where it could be, and reports are that Cohen is meeting with the New York Attorney General's office. I don't think Cohen is meeting with them about the Trump Foundation. They have already filed that lawsuit, and they've referred that to criminal investigators within New York State. But my sense is that Cohen's information would be related to potential criminal wrongdoing by members of the Trump organization. And there's a lot there that's ripe for the taking. I mean, there was the ProPublica did a fantastic, along with WNBC, did a fantastic piece on what Tim was talking about, all of this foreign influence and foreign money, and the potential criminal lies made by the Trump's kids that are very material to getting investments, by saying, for example, we have 60% of the apartments sold in this new project, when in reality, in one case, I think they had 0. And that induces other people to invest falsely, and that's a crime. So I do think there's a lot there that is ripe for the taking, but this, of course, is separate from the special counsel's investigation.
do you want to go ahead?
No, go, please.
Another name in this mix I would add is a guy named Alan Weisselberg, who was a career accountant. He was Fred. He's the same age as Donald Trump. He's about 72 or so. He was Fred Trump's accountant starting in the 1970s. He then became the CFO of the Trump organization, but the Trump Organization it's not a Fortune 500 company. It's a very small boutique operation that ran it at the president's whim. And Weisselberg prepared all of the president's personal income tax returns, the company's corporate returns in conjunction with an outside firm, and knows where all of where the money was coming in and out of the organization. And he's been indemnified, I guess, right? He doesn't have a cooperation agreement.
He's been given immunity in order to compel him to testify in the grand jury, which I think it sounds quite technical, but is an important difference, because a cooperating witness like Michael Cohen is volunteering. I mean, he's not technically cooperating, but someone who is cooperating with the investigation is giving him as much information as he can to get a benefit in return. Someone who's compelled to testify who would say, I'm not going to go into the grand jury, I'm taking the fifth. Then the government gets an immunity order which says you're actually immune from any prosecution for your testimony, and therefore he has no Fifth Amendment right anymore. So that's a very different thing, and that someone is in a very different posture where he's not incentivized in any way, shape, or form to give a lot of information. He needs to tell the truth, but there are lots of shades of the truth in a situation
and
like
he
that.
came into sort of public awareness via the Stormy Daniels stuff, because Michael Cohen produced a recording and they were talking about how to mask the payments to Stormy Daniels and hide them through a network of LLCs. And Cohen was heard on this tape saying to Trump, I'll talk to Alan about it. And everyone asked, well, who's Alan? And we knew it was Alan Weisselberg. And he has knowledge of those particular transactions, which gets to possible campaign finance violations. I don't know how threatened Trump is by those. But now he's exposed to a certain extent. And he knows much more than Michael. Michael Cohen didn't go to work to the Trump Organization until 2006. Trump didn't let him see the books. He really didn't have much of a pivotal role in most of the Trump Organization's business dealings, but Trump used him like he used to use Roy Cohn, which is an attack dog attorney who would just try to weaponize the law and tie people up in court. Weisselberg goes way back, and he knows far more about the intricate and intimate dealings of the company.
It's something you just said that raised the question: if you are, trying to predict, what do you think that the president or his administration, what are they most worried about coming out of the special counsel's investigation? Is it?
That
it
for
seems,
me, or?
Yeah, for you. Well, for both of you, but start with you.
Well, I think it's really important to understand about Donald Trump is he profoundly doesn't care about anyone else but himself, in a way that it's so profoundly other. It maybe would touch a bit on his children. I've always thought if Mueller comes close to Jared Kushner or Don Jr., Trump will fire him. I think that will happen in 5 seconds. And he won't care about the constitutional implications of doing that. He won't care about rule of law. We already know he has no respect for the rule of law. The nation's top law enforcement official does not care a whit about the rule of law. I think the two easiest ways to understand what motivates almost 100% of what Trump does is either it's about self-aggrandizement or self-preservation. And the self-aggrandizement explains why he ran for president. He wasn't policy-driven. He likes to be center stage. And the self-preservation piece of it is he will do almost anything to protect himself. He will throw old associates under the bus. The only exception to that might be his children. So I think for Trump personally, he's clearly deeply afraid of this investigation because he's invaded against it so frequently and so early on, and he took significant steps like sacking Jim Comey to insulate himself. I think he knows there's something there that is damaging to him. Otherwise, he wouldn't be acting the way he is. I don't think he's worried about getting impeached. I think he would blow things up if that began. He'd see what would happen. I think he's more worried about his children than anything.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to make sure we have enough time for questions, but we'll go for a little bit longer. So the special counsel's office, that investigation is certainly not the only corruption-related scandal that has been plaguing this White House. It seems that there has been, in only the first short years, there's been a whole range of others that have come under fire for unethical acts, in some cases domestic violence. So there's been a lot of attention paid to this and talk of corruption, a culture of corruption within the Trump White House. But this is not the only administration to have been plagued by this. So maybe, Tim, you could speak to this. Is this White House and this administration, have they been facing more corruption scandals? Is it a more corrupt administration than we've seen in, obviously you have Nixon, you have the troubles plaguing the Clintons. Is this administration special in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the most financially conflicted presidency in the post-World War II era. I'm sure 19th century presidencies where there was all sorts of horse trading. Some of the most significant, federal conflict of interest law came out of the Civil War period initially because of graft involved with military and government contracts at the time. There was a second wave right after Watergate. But we haven't had a president enter office with a significant business and financial portfolio like Trump. And for me, I don't even think that's an ideological or partisan issue. I think good government involves transparency and accountability. And if a president, if he or she comes into office and they have financial interests that are going to shade their public policy-making decisions, that should be addressed. Uniquely in the United States, the president and the vice president are essentially excused from most federal conflicts of interest law. Trump didn't know that before he became president, and you can see it one of the first the first press conference he gave after becoming president. He was really happy. He discovered, he said, I can't have conflicts of interest, which is actually not true. Just the law protects him from getting prosecuted for them or having to divest. He hasn't meaningfully divested. And when the president doesn't do it, people down the food chain don't do it. So you have Wilbur Ross, who's the Commerce Secretary, who was told within a month of being sworn in that he had about a 60 to 90-day period, depending on the various assets he had, to divest. And he didn't do it. He held on to them for over a year. Some of these assets involved a tanker business in North Korea when he was out doing trade policy with North Korea, a steel business in China when he was doing trade policy with China, another business that involved relative of Vladimir Putin, all of which is just pure conflict. It's come up with Betsy DeVos. I think Scott Pruitt's tenure, although it was pure conflict of interest. It was less about his business holdings. It was more about just the way he was conducting himself as a federal official. I think they've all been empowered by him to act flagrantly. And then you have I think the GOP lacks the political courage to define what is contemporary conservatism, and then what is the law, and does this man comport with both, and to stand up for those things. And so there are no regulators, moral, legal, or personal, around this individual, and it bleeds through his government. And I don't think there's been any government at all that's administration close to this in terms of corruption.
Interesting. Dan, you're the lawyer here, the resident legal expert. So there has been this lawsuit filed that says that Trump is violating this pesky emoluments clause. Do you think that's actually something that will be significant for him? Is this something that's going to have an impact, or is this going to be waved aside and be a nothing?
So, yeah, I think actually it's a very interesting development. As you guys probably know, there is a part of the emoluments clause of the Constitution which prevents a president from making any financial gain, not just the president, I guess, public official, but right? Isn't it? Yeah. From any
but generating. But the emoluments clause speaks specifically to the presidency.
Okay, yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, I haven't looked at it recently.
Put you on the spot, sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, I think there are a couple of different ways that this is going to help, but essentially you can't make money from being president. And the idea is, as Tim said, there aren't clear divestiture requirements for a president, but there are restrictions to make sure that the president is acting in good faith and faithfully preserving the laws. There are two things that are interesting that could come from this. First of all, if it has teeth, and it really relates mostly to the Trump Hotel in D.C., and the president using that hotel to sort of solicit or generate income from foreign dignitaries that come into the country, who are there's been reporting that they actually try to stay there to curry favor with
like
the
Saudis, for example.
Like the Saudis, exactly. So I actually think there's some potential liability. I think he's less afraid of the liability, but I think what will be really interesting is what documents and materials come out of that lawsuit, which the one in Maryland is, I think, the furthest ahead. There are several of these. But it'll be really interesting to see what documents they have to turn over in discovery and what materials come out of it. And it will, because he's been so secretive, it may be a way that we get a little bit of an opening of the kimono of some of the president's finances and some of his wheelings and dealings behind the scenes. And it's also one of the very few ways to get at presidential corruption, other than the special counsel's investigation. Certainly the cabinet officials, some of whom Tim mentioned, can be investigated by both Congress and law enforcement, and I hope they are, because some of this stuff is really egregious. But there's far more limitations on what the president can really be investigated for. But this is a pathway that might be really revealing.
And the other thing is that every president since Gerald Ford has released their tax returns, not because they have to, but because they think it signals their willingness to be transparent and to put ethics first in government. And
to ensure the public that they have no conflict of interest when they're dealing with foreign countries.
Yeah. I was just looking the other day
at
for another show at this first Trump press conference where he addressed the conflicts of interest issue, and he said he's going to divest his business holdings and put it into a blind trust controlled by his sons and his accountant, Alan Weisselberg, which is not a blind trust. And his attorney during the conference said, well, people just used to not care about this stuff. When Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as vice president, nobody cared about this. And that's just factually it's untrue. It's actually they were more conscientious about this back then. When Nelson Rockefeller, who had a fortune far in excess of anything Trump's ever even dreamed of, got nominated to be vice president by Gerald Ford, he had to sit through, I think, 3 days, at least 2 days, of congressional hearings where they went through his tax returns publicly. They went through Standard Oil and the Rockefeller family's business holdings. They said, is this going to conflict with our dealings with Venezuela because your family has business there? It was just very pointed, grueling questions, and it was embarrassing because his finances were out there. But he said during the hearing, I believe as a public official I should do this. And I think that era, I think they were actually more conscientious about it. I think Trump has enabled a kind of a blasé approach to this stuff. It doesn't matter. Trust us. We'll do the right thing anyway.
All right, I want to make sure we get enough time for your questions, so I will turn the floor over to you. Do you guys have questions for Tim and Dan? Yes, go ahead.
I read in the news that it's possible the Justice Department can get this report from Mueller and keep it private and not have to get it out to the rest of us. So I was curious if you think that's going to happen. If it is there a way that someone can get to have it or force it to be made public, etc.?
So the special counsel is appointed pursuant to a regulation of the Department of Justice. It's different than Ken Starr, who was an independent counsel. It's different even than in Watergate. As part of those regulations, the special counsel must provide a report of his findings to the Attorney General overseeing the investigation. In this case, that's Rod Rosenstein, because Jeff Sessions is conflicted out. So at that point, it is really up to the Attorney General to decide what to do with the report. And there is very little guidance on, from the regulations at least, as to what the Attorney General should do in that instance. So there's sort of two schools of thought. One is that it just, given the attention that this investigation has received, it's almost impossible to imagine that it would just simply not get out there to the public. I mean, that just seems, from sort of a democracy standpoint, as we all sit here paying attention to it, looking at it, concerned about it, that it's just almost impossible to imagine that somehow it would not get out there. The one of the real issues is with this report is that it likely will include grand jury information. Grand jury information must remain secret unless it's revealed either through the court process or, in very rare instances, by court order. A court can order that it is unsealed. There is I do imagine a path where a new attorney general is put in who is a Trump acolyte and a Trump apologist who tries to cut the legs out of the report by perhaps using the excuse of grand jury information to say, well, we would love to publicize this report, but we can't. So what we'll do is we will put together a summary that
members of Congress can see in a closed room, and they won't be able to take it out of the room.
Right. I mean,
or tell you about it after the fact.
Yeah, but I do think that even that summary would likely get out, but that summary could be very slanted, and that would not be the words of Robert Mueller and his team. It would be the words of somebody else, most likely. So I tend to believe that somehow this is getting out. I just don't
Did the Kavanaugh hearings give you pause at all on that from a just process standpoint? Because one of the things, there were many things I found distressing about the Kavanaugh hearing, but the process, the way, just process was handled around it, getting his documentation out to the public, handling testimony, and then the FBI report on his personal behavior, where that was really locked down for the most part. I sort of wondered, will this Congress, really put a lot of roadblocks in front of anything at all, even a summary getting public?
Right. So that's the second question: is where does the report go from the Attorney General? Presumably, it will go to Congress for them to. And we're assuming it's a report, by the way, that really relates to the president, because almost certainly the president is not going to be indicted. Other people can be indicted. If Bob Mueller has evidence of crimes committed by anyone other than the president, we won't really see that in a report because we'll probably see it in an indictment. So let's assume, for the sake of this conversation, that we're just talking about a report related to the president's misdeeds. If he lays out in great detail criminal behavior or something that could amount to a high crime and misdemeanor, it will, in some capacity, get its way to Congress. So I'm not sure, though, that it's Congress's responsibility alone to publicize it, because it could also be publicized by the Department of Justice. So there are two avenues in which the report might be publicized. And, there is no right answer here. We don't know. I think we're all sort of speculating. And I think at the end of the day, you do get a good sense of the background investigation of Brett Kavanaugh, which remained confidential. We did not learn what the FBI found. We did not learn what Mark Judge said to the FBI, which is truly, which is somewhat remarkable, I think. But, in this day and age of leaking, I just cannot imagine that this report does not get out. There are two different questions. Does it get out? The
other wild card is,
formally?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, does it get out officially or does it get out unofficially?
Which, if the House changes hands in the midterms, then you've got Jerry Nadler most likely running Judiciary, who knows the law, and you've got Adam Schiff on House Intelligence, who have been vocal opponents, and I've wondered if they would use subpoena power after the election to try to get into some of this if it goes off the rails.
Potentially,
yeah. Go ahead.
I kind of want to ask about the media aspect of all this. You've both done a really great job going through, in the last 45 minutes, the kind of sprawling extent of Donald Trump's corruption and conflicts. How do you get that down into a 5 to 10 minute MSNBC thing, especially given that...
I would love 10 minutes.
Dan just makes it up.
Especially when, at the end of the day, it's likely going to be public opinion that enforces any amount of accountability on the Trump administration.
I don't think about it strategically like that. I think it's a really important time for people to remember that facts matter, even if the president doesn't respect them, even if there's a lot of demagoguery around fake news and, bombs being sent to people in the news. I see it as a service when I go on those shows to try to speak almost entirely to the fact pattern and not speculate when I can about what's occurred in a way that gives an average person a sense of why these things matter, whether it's financial conflicts of interest or collusion with Russia, and why it should matter to them. So I think that tends to be in the front of mind for me. Most of these shows, before they air, they know the topics they want to hit. They tell their guests the topics that you're going to discuss. So you have a little time in advance to think about what's important to you to raise as points on those topics. I have no idea, though, if this actually enlightens people or just confuses them further or just raises the level of anxiety. Because there's a really the media right now is involved in this very unusual and I think unprecedented bout of national therapy because, I think people were surprised by the election. At least, say, 63 million people were. And
well, I think the president was surprised.
The president, he definitely was surprised. That's totally that's entirely accurate, as was his entire campaign and his family. And I think people are sort of looking to the media often to take sides or to sort this out for everyone. I thought the story about Rod Rosenstein when this issue of whether or not he made a joke, whether or not he was joking when he did or did not encourage other members of the Justice Department and the FBI to wear a wire when they were with the president. When the story first came out, everyone said, well, the New York Times should never have reported that, and it's probably garbage. He may have done it once. He was just joking. But then as the reporting progressed, it looked like he said it to several people. In moments like that, and I'm a commentary writer now, so I'm allowed to have an opinion, but the standard newspaper reporting apparatus in the country has to report what comes through the door. And it's a tricky moment because people want the news and the information to heal them or to get rid of things that make them uncomfortable. And that's not really the role of the media. The role of the media, I think, is to put facts in front of people so you can decide.
It's become much more difficult in this age of just repeated and outright lies. Because Tim's right. Traditionally the media will, to overgeneralize, will have information from one side and statements from one side, and then you get statements from the other side, and you kind of present that. But what do you do as a media organization if one side is giving you facts and the other side is giving you provable lies? What is your obligation then to do when you publish a story? And I think that it has presented new issues and problems for venerable media institutions, including the New York Times. You raised that story, which I think is a great example. I didn't have a problem with the New York Times publishing it. What I had a problem with, though, is that I thought that the New York Times reporter should have done more research, or at least included more in that article about what the process would be for someone to wire up against the president. I went on air, actually right after Michael Schmidt, who wrote that story, and I said that to me, it's so obviously sarcastic because of the extensive laundry list of protocols and procedures that you would have to
You could
follow.
never keep it private.
You would never keep it private. He wasn't even under investigation at the time. And there are just so many different reasons why it was almost farcical that he would be serious. And so while I respected the fact that he had multiple sources who said that they took it seriously, I didn't think there was enough balance to measure what that would mean if they did. And so we struggle with that all the time. I view my job very importantly, somewhat as a public service as well, because Bob Mueller is quiet and there's nothing coming from that office, and the president and Giuliani and others are so vocal. I kind of view my role as to fill that vacuum and that void from the law enforcement perspective, to say, this is how investigations work, this is how they might be doing it, how I would have done it in being in similar situations that I was, and this is what matters, this is what doesn't matter, and so try to provide that information that the general public might not understand filling in to some extent from the special counsel's office. But, I think both Tim and I agree that it's not up to us to have opinions, as to whether this is valid or invalid. It's tempting because so much of what the president says is
invalid.
Is invalid, and that's right. Yeah. But to your point, as to how we balance it, I think it is it's very important to try to just provide context for what is being reported, and we have to then get into the question and rely on what the reporting is.
I get really excited when he says something that is demonstrably provable as false, and it's in a historical fact pattern. Like when he gave the other night when he said, "I'm a nationalist." And then he said he didn't really know what that was. He's just saying he's a nationalist. And, he kept a book of Hitler's speeches by his nightstand, in his bedroom, in Trump Tower. That is a fact. He's acknowledged it, period. And I couldn't wait to put that in a column. Not because it's, I got you, but it's important that I think the public understands the dimensions of this man and what informs his thinking, because he's a profound racist. He's not just a race baiter. And he's not someone who only uses race as a political tool. He believes in profound genetic differences among people. He speaks he always said, my granddaughter has great genes. He says this kind of stuff frequently. And his father had sort of an Aryan philosophy of life that Donald absorbed. And that can't but, inform, when he uses the term nationalist, he knows exactly what it means. And when his defenders come up and say, well, he just meant it like put America first so you could have better trade agreements with China. No, that's not what that means.
Yeah, well, and what is truly scary, and I think the biggest fundamental issue that we're facing is his attacks on the media and his co-opting of the term fake news is the first significant step to autocracy and fascism. And it's what happened with Hitler. And once if you can knock out the objective news media as a legitimate entity that is providing a critical check, and that is what our country is founded on, then you can do anything you want to do. Yeah, and that's really what he is trying to get after.
This morning, the Times had this crazy story last night about Trump doesn't observe phone security. That the Chinese and the Russians are surveilling him because he uses 3 different phones and won't comply with the intelligence community's request that he act like an adult with his phones. And this morning, a spokeswoman for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said, "Oh, that's just fake news." And then a spokesman for the Kremlin said, "We were laughing at that joke report. It's fake news." And that's so this fake news propagandizing is international. Authoritarian regimes recognize the uses it can be put to. And we're in a time where really it's going to be on citizens to have to discern in a much more sophisticated way what's behind the information that they're seeing.
And let's not forget what fake news really was, which was all of the fake news placed on Facebook and other social media sites by Russia. There is an actual term for it.
Yeah. And that's one of the geniuses of Trump. Right. His perverse genius is he turned that in one of his first press conferences when Jim Acosta of CNN said, "I'd like to ask you a question." Trump said, "No, you're fake news." And it was right at the moment that fake news that Russians had put on social media platforms was finally kind of becoming clear to people. And Trump turned that, like he did the caravan in Central America. He's very astute about how to turn people intellectually and emotionally against their own self-interest.
I was just curious, speaking of Rosenstein and the tape recording, whether they reported a few weeks ago that he was about to get canned, whether that's now going to happen after the midterms, what effect you think that might have over the investigation, whether the reports from our crazy Uncle Rudy that it'll wrap up by the end of the year, whether you buy into those, or just how you see the pace of it moving forward.
So the Rosenstein question is very interesting, and so is the Sessions question, because Trump has been so outspokenly critical of both of them, yet has not fired them. And he obviously can fire them. He fired Comey. And there are little moments when you actually see sort of I don't think it's Trump himself, but he is listening to someone in his ear recommending that he not do something for political reasons. And so ultimately, I think that the scuttlebutt is that after the election, he is more likely to replace Sessions. If he replaces Sessions with someone who's not recused, then that person takes over the investigation of Russia. It will be a very difficult confirmation process, and there's all sorts of very complicated sequencing in of potential other people who have already been confirmed is one way of doing it. So it gets quite complicated. But you know, I think we will absolutely hear more from the special counsel before the end of the year. But I do not think it is all going to wrap up. It is. I can't. I mean, we talked about it before, but when you're getting so much information from someone like Paul Manafort, it opens up all different avenues that you have to track down and chase down. And so there's so much more investigation that flows from someone cooperating like that, particularly when he's so central. So I would be very surprised if the whole thing wraps up by the end of the year. We very well may see an indictment of Roger Stone and perhaps others very soon after the election. But I also, frankly, would be surprised if the report on most likely on obstruction. The president's really the only one who's being investigated for obstruction. Obviously, there are a number of people investigated for collusion. I would be very surprised to see that report before the whole investigation is done. That is not traditionally how
So it won't come out
a prosecutor
in pieces?
No, I don't think so. I think you wrap it all up with a report, and in particular because I think the report may also include aspects of the investigation into collusion as it relates to the president, in addition to obstruction.
But there won't be a collusion report, an obstruction report.
Look, I don't know. It's possible.
Financial fraud report or whatever.
You know, one of the things, and Jen and Barrett and I all worked in the same office, and Barrett worked in the Eastern District, which does things similar to the Southern District of New York. I felt previously like I could speak with more authority on what the special counsel is doing, but there have been a number of things that I've been very surprised as to how they've handled things. The fact that they dismissed counts against Rick Gates, who was a cooperating witness, was very surprising to me. I thought for sure that Michael Flynn would be charged with more crimes than false statements, because even just the public reporting indicated that he was involved in so much more. If he truly is going to be sentenced in December, as they have said, that's an indication that they did give him that sweetheart deal. I can guarantee you that in traditional Eastern District, Southern District prosecution, that's not how we would do it. You would have to plead guilty to all of the crimes that you committed as a cooperating witness. And so they're doing things a little bit differently, and this is also just a totally different animal with tremendous political pressure, daily political pressure from the president and Congress increasingly to wrap it up. So it's possible that you'd have a separate report just on obstruction that is issued. I wouldn't do it that way, but there are reasons to do it that way.
You know, when Rosenstein went over to the White House the day everyone thought he was going to get fired, he didn't get fired because the president was out of town, and so you know, John Kelly met him at the door and shepherded him around a while, gave him a sandwich, and he left. One of the things that came out of that was that Rosenstein said he really wanted to make sure that he left on good terms with the president. And that was one of the reasons he went over. And I thought to myself, oh, Stockholm Syndrome. You know, you've been pounded on so much here that, you know, one of your goals is to leave on good terms with your boss rather than see this through the right way. That may not be fair of me, because I don't know enough about the facts around it. But as I just reading that amount of information, I thought if that's important to him, Donald Trump is going to eat him alive, because Donald Trump recognizes that in people. You know, Donald Trump is ignorant. He can't do math. He can barely add. Literally, I'm not joking. Look on a Howard Stern interview with him online where he's asked to multiply 16 times 7, and he can't. Neither can his children, by the way, and it's funny. But anyway, you know, he doesn't have the tools. He's not a sophisticated intellectual or public servant, but he's got a predator sensibility about where people's vulnerabilities and needs are. And I just think that's part of how he's assessing Rosenstein and the Justice Department. It's a really important time, you know, for institutions in the United States to assert their nonpartisan, socially responsible reasons for being, whether it's law enforcement or the media. the business community, voters, the Congress, because those institutions exist to prevent people from running roughshod over our community. And he's running roughshod.
And I'll just add one other thing on Rosenstein. He gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal last week, 2 weeks ago. Yeah. And one of the things that he said, which, by the way, in and of itself is very odd, but one of the things he said is, we are running an independent investigation, and I think that the president sees that and supports that. It is absolutely preposterous that any Department of Justice official would be worried about what the president thinks of a specific investigation of any sort, particularly one into him. And so it just gives a little odd kind of context to how Rosenstein seems to be thinking about a lot of this, which is on the one hand. On the other hand, he's held his ground pretty well, and he's done a pretty good job of navigating a difficult situation to ultimately protect the investigation.
And he appointed Bob Mueller.
Yeah, but particularly as he's dealt with the House Republicans who have really been hounding him. And I don't necessarily agree with everything that he's done in giving in to them, but I do see the wisdom in taking that route.
All right. Well, we're going to get kicked out of here. So
Okay.
Thank you guys so much.